Hollywood's brightest stars may have captivated millions on screen, but their final wishes revealed sides of them that were even more bizarre, scandalous, and unforgettable than the roles they played. Imagine arriving late to your own funeral, demanding to be buried with diamonds worth a fortune, or insisting your body be dressed forever in Dracula's cape. These weren't rumors, they were the carefully chosen last acts of icons who refused to follow the rules of ordinary life. From shocking exclusions in wills that tore families apart, to crypts that became shrines for obsessed fans, these legends made sure that even death itself became part of their performance. Elizabeth Taylor, fashionably late to her own funeral. Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed icon of Hollywood, lived her life as though every moment was part of a grand performance, and she wasn't about to let death change the script. Known for her breathtaking beauty, 8 marriages, and an opulent lifestyle that often dominated headlines, Taylor's final request shocked even those closest to her. She insisted that her funeral begin on time, but that her casket not arrive until 15 minutes later. To her, this wasn't a joke or a playful stunt. It was a deliberate act, a last flourish to remind the world that Elizabeth Taylor lived and died on her own terms. But Taylor's theatrical exit wasn't the only unusual detail of her burial. She also asked to be laid to rest wearing a pair of her favorite diamond earrings, studs rumored to be worth more than most people's homes. These glittering jewels were more than just accessories. They symbolized the glamour, wealth, and extravagance that defined her public persona. Even as her body was lowered into the ground, Taylor ensured that the image of her would be inseparable from diamonds, beauty, and the sense of larger-than-life grandeur that had always followed her. What surprises many is the location and presentation of her final resting place. Elizabeth Taylor lies buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but her grave remains unmarked. For a woman who once commanded the world's attention, this choice seemed almost contradictory. Some speculate it was to avoid turning her resting place into a tourist attraction, while others believe it was her last attempt at reclaiming privacy after a lifetime of relentless scrutiny. Whether an act of humility, secrecy, or defiance, Taylor's burial reflected the same contradictions that defined her life: dazzling opulence wrapped in mystery, a final performance that continues to intrigue her fans decades later. Joan Crawford. Final act of ice. Joan Crawford's life was marked by reinvention, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of stardom, but her final wishes revealed a darker, more fractured side of her story. When she passed away in 1977, Crawford chose cremation and requested a modest crypt at Ferncliff Cemetery in New York, a surprisingly understated decision for a woman who once embodied the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's golden age. Far from the spotlight of Los Angeles, this resting place reflected a withdrawal from the very world that had both made her and haunted her. The real shock, however, came not from where she was buried, but from the cold precision of her will. Crawford deliberately excluded her 2 eldest adopted children, Christina and Christopher, from any inheritance. The will contained only one cutting line addressed to them, for reasons which are well known to them. That sentence sparked endless speculation, fueling the narrative of a complicated, perhaps toxic, family dynamic. Christina later added gasoline to the fire with her infamous memoir, Mommy Dearest, which painted Crawford as a cruel, tyrannical figure behind closed doors. Whether truth, exaggeration, or personal vendetta, it left Crawford's reputation forever divided between adoration and condemnation. Her ashes were placed in the same crypt as her final husband, Alfred Steele, the Pepsi-Cola executive who had given her stability in her later years. But for someone who spent decades commanding attention with every performance, her crypt remains surprisingly quiet, nearly anonymous. There are no towering monuments, no dramatic epitaphs, just silence. In many ways, Crawford's final resting place mirrors the contradictions of her life. A woman who projected power and glamour to the world, yet left behind a legacy clouded with bitterness, secrecy, and unanswered questions. Bela Lugosi. Dracula, even in death. Bela Lugosi will forever be remembered as the man who brought Count Dracula to life, his piercing eyes and thick Hungarian accent turning him into a legend of horror cinema. Yet while the character made him a star, it also trapped him in a shadow he could never escape. Lugosi became so closely tied to Dracula that casting directors struggled to see him in any other role, and by the time of his death in 1956, he was both celebrated and haunted by the character that had defined and consumed his career. Perhaps that's why his final request was as eerie as it was poetic. Lugosi wished to be buried in full Dracula costume, complete with the iconic black cape. This wasn't a studio gimmick or publicity stunt, but his own decision to embrace the role that had both lifted him to fame and contributed to his downfall. Despite struggling financially in his later years, dying with little money and far from Hollywood's glitz, Lugosi's burial ensured that his name and image would remain forever intertwined with the Prince of Darkness. His funeral was a modest affair, attended only by a small group of close friends and family. Yet his grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in California quickly became a pilgrimage site for horror fans who saw his burial in costume as the ultimate merging of actor and character. Even in death, Lugosi could not separate himself from Dracula, and perhaps he never truly wanted to. His final resting place stands as a haunting reminder of how one role can define an entire life, echoing the chilling line audiences will never forget: he was Dracula, both on screen and beneath the ground. Wallace Reid, the silent film idol's quiet goodbye. In the 1910s and early 1920s, Wallace Reid was the golden boy of silent cinema. With his good looks and effortless charm, he became a matinee idol adored by millions, often cast as the dashing hero who could do no wrong. But behind the glamour was a devastating secret. Reid had developed a dependency on morphine after a studio doctor prescribed it to ease the pain of a severe injury. What began as a medical treatment spiraled into a struggle that tarnished his health, his career, and ultimately his life. When Reid died in 1923 at the young age of 31, Hollywood was left stunned. For a star so associated with vitality and romance, his decline was both tragic and sobering. His final request, however, revealed a softer and more intimate side. He asked to be buried with a small silver locket containing a photograph of his wife Dorothy Davenport. To those who knew him, the gesture was a haunting acknowledgement of the love he had nearly destroyed during his darkest years, and of the woman who had stood by him as his world unraveled. Unlike the grand mausoleums many stars chose, Reid's burial was modest, almost intentionally unremarkable. His simple grave stood in sharp contrast to the fame he once enjoyed, reflecting perhaps a final wish to shed the larger-than-life persona that Hollywood had built around him. For fans, the image of that hidden locket became a symbol of the man behind the myth, a reminder that beneath the fame, there was a human being racked with regret, longing, and love. Pola Negri, Valentino's Phantom Ashes. Pola Negri was one of the silent film era's most dramatic and eccentric figures, both on and off the screen. Known for her tempestuous romances and flair for scandal, she relished the attention that came with her celebrity status. But her burial request shocked even those who had grown accustomed to her theatrics. Negri claimed she possessed a vial containing the ashes of her former lover, Rudolph Valentino, the Latin lover whose sudden death in 1926 left Hollywood reeling. She insisted that this vial be buried with her, a final act of devotion that blurred the line between romance and spectacle. The problem was, no official record ever confirmed that Valentino had been cremated, let alone that ashes were distributed to anyone. Historians and fans alike remain divided over whether Negri truly possessed a portion of his remains or if the claim was yet another of her legendary embellishments. To many, the ashes symbolize not so much a real keepsake as a continuation of her lifelong performance, feeding the public's fascination with her connection to one of Hollywood's greatest icons. Whether true or fabricated, the story cemented Negri's reputation as someone who never let facts get in the way of a compelling narrative. Her grave at Forest Lawn Cemetery reflected this blend of drama and mystery. Adorned with ornate carvings and a distinctly European aesthetic, it became less a resting place and more a stage for her final performance. Visitors came not only to honor her legacy, but also to puzzle over the mystery she left behind. Was the vial genuine, or was it Pola's last act of theatrical self-mythologizing? In death, as in life, she ensured that people would keep asking questions long after the curtain had fallen. Tallulah Bankhead, bourbon, cigarettes, and a Bible. Tallulah Bankhead was one of Hollywood's most magnetic personalities, famous for her husky voice, razor-sharp wit, and refusal to play by anyone's rules but her own. Known as much for her outrageous off-screen antics as for her work on stage and screen, she lived a life of contradictions, wild, rebellious, and unapologetically free. When it came to her final wishes, Bankhead remained true to form, requesting to be buried with 3 items that summed up her spirit: a bottle of bourbon, a pack of cigarettes, and a copy of the Bible. It was a combination that perfectly reflected the paradoxes of her life: hedonism and irreverence balanced with an enduring sense of spirituality. Her funeral, held in 1968, was a subdued affair compared to the life she had lived. Yet her burial instructions injected a spark of her irreverent humor and defiance, ensuring that even in death she remained unmistakably Tallulah. Friends and fans alike recognized the symbolism. The bourbon and cigarettes were tokens of her famously indulgent lifestyle, while the Bible spoke to a deeper, more complicated layer of her identity. It was a reminder that beneath the laughter and rebellion, there was a woman who grappled with questions of faith and meaning. Bankhead's final resting place was also unexpected. Rather than Hollywood, she chose to be buried in St. Paul's Churchyard in Chestertown, Maryland, close to her family's roots. For a woman who had once dazzled Broadway and Hollywood with her charisma, this modest choice felt surprising. Yet it reflected her desire for connection and belonging after a life spent in constant motion. In the end, Tallulah Bankhead's burial carried the same contradictions that made her unforgettable: Wild yet tender, rebellious yet rooted, larger than life yet deeply human. Clark Gable. Forever beside Carole Lombard, Clark Gable, forever remembered as the king of Hollywood and the unforgettable Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, projected an image of strength, confidence, and charm. But behind the swagger was a man whose heart was marked by tragedy. The great love of his life was actress Carole Lombard, whose sudden death in a 1942 plane crash devastated him. Though Gable remarried twice after her passing, those close to him knew that his heart never truly healed from the loss. His burial request revealed just how deeply he carried that grief. When Gable died in 1960, he was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, in a grave chosen specifically to be beside Lombard. This decision spoke louder than any Hollywood headline could. Decades after her death, he still wanted to spend eternity at her side. For fans, it was a powerful reminder that behind the legend of Gable stood a man defined not only by his screen presence, but also by his enduring devotion to the woman he loved most. Their graves, side by side, tell a story that no film could capture, a love that transcended fame and outlasted even death itself. What's most striking about Gable's resting place is its simplicity. Marked only by a modest plaque, it stands in sharp contrast to the grandeur and spectacle often associated with his name. The man who once defined Hollywood's golden age chose humility and intimacy for his final chapter. His burial wasn't about the king of Hollywood, it was about Clark and Carole, together again. For fans visiting the site, the simple marker feels like a quiet love letter, a testament to the kind of devotion that even time, tragedy, and death could not erase. Errol Flynn. Hedonism even at the end. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling star of The Adventures of Robin Hood, lived a life as daring and flamboyant as the roles he played. Known for his good looks, charm, and notorious off-screen behavior, Flynn embodied the archetype of Hollywood excess. He was a man who thrived on adventure, scandal, and indulgence, and when he contemplated his death, his wishes reflected that very same spirit. Among his most unusual requests was to be buried with a 6-foot statue of a nude woman, an extravagant possession that had stood in his home as a symbol of beauty, desire, and his hedonistic lifestyle. Practicality, however, intervened. The massive statue proved impossible to include in his burial, and ultimately, Flynn was laid to rest without it. Instead, his funeral was surprisingly modest, attended by only a close circle of friends and family. For a man who had lived under constant scrutiny, both adored and criticized for his excesses, the quiet farewell stood in stark contrast to the theatricality of his life. It was almost as though Hollywood itself had paused, recognizing that Flynn's final act could not match the spectacle of his living years. His grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Park bears only a simple marker, offering no grand tribute to the star's legacy. Yet in its understatement lies a kind of irony. The actor who embodied flamboyance and controversy was remembered in death with restraint. And still, the legend of his burial request persists, a reminder of the man who never stopped chasing beauty and indulgence, even in death. In many ways, Flynn's final story is as layered as his life, a mix of excess, simplicity, and the unshakable allure of a man who lived unapologetically. John Harlow, the white crypt of the blonde bombshell. John Harlow, Hollywood's original blonde bombshell, rose to fame in the 1930s with her platinum hair, captivating screen presence, and magnetic energy. But her life was tragically short. She died in 1937 at only 26 years old, leaving behind a stunned industry and heartbroken fans. Harlow's final request was strikingly symbolic. She wished to be buried in a white gown, surrounded by white flowers, and placed in a white marble crypt. The choice was no accident. It was a deliberate statement of how she wanted to be remembered, not for the scandals and tragedies that often surrounded her, but for purity, light, and glamour. Her crypt became one of the most talked about burial sites of its era. Located at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, it was often called the Taj Mahal of the West because of its grandeur. Fittingly, the expense was not covered by her family, but by William Powell, the actor and Harlow's great love, who was devastated by her untimely passing. Powell made sure she was honored with a resting place that reflected her beauty and status, ensuring that her short life would not be diminished by a modest farewell. His gesture was seen by many as one of Hollywood's most poignant acts of devotion. The all-white imagery of her burial created a haunting juxtaposition. On one hand, it reflected the radiant, glamorous woman audiences adored. On the other, it was a painful reminder of her innocence lost to the harsh spotlight of Hollywood. Fans who visit her crypt today still see it as both a shrine and a symbol, a place where beauty, tragedy, and myth collide. Jean Harlow's final resting place was not just a grave, it was a monument to a life that burned too brightly and ended far too soon. Mary Pickford. America's sweetheart chooses family. Mary Pickford, often hailed as America's sweetheart, wasn't just a beloved actress of the silent era. She was also one of Hollywood's most powerful women. As a co-founder of United Artists and one of the highest paid stars of her time, she commanded influence both on and off the screen. But despite her extraordinary success, Pickford's final wishes revealed a woman who longed for something far simpler than fame or fortune, the comfort of family. When she died in 1979, she chose to be buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, not in the spotlight of its grand mausoleums, but in a secluded area called the Garden of Memory. This location was deeply symbolic. It was here that she could rest alongside her beloved mother and siblings, the people who had anchored her throughout her life. Pickford's decision stood in stark contrast to the dazzling public persona she had carried for decades. Instead of a monumental crypt designed to impress, she selected a private, tranquil space that reflected her personal priorities. It was a choice that highlighted the tension between her Hollywood image and her private self, a reminder that even the most iconic stars sought solace in the same bonds that ordinary people cherished. Her crypt carries an inscription that reads, "America's Sweetheart," a title she had both embraced and grown weary of during her career. While the world may have remembered her as the smiling ingenue who charmed millions, Pickford's final act was one of quiet defiance against the pressures of fame. She chose to be remembered not just as a star, but as a daughter, a sister, and a woman who, in the end, valued family above all else. For visitors today, her resting place is a gentle reminder that behind Hollywood's legends were human beings who craved connection just as deeply as the audiences who adored them. Rudolph Valentino, the Latin lover, and the Lady in Black. Rudolph Valentino, the original Latin lover, was one of Hollywood's first true sex symbols, captivating audiences in the 1920s with his smoldering gaze and romantic screen presence. His sudden death in 1926, at just 31 years old, sent shockwaves through the entertainment world, sparking mass hysteria among fans who could not fathom losing such an icon so soon. Unlike many stars, Valentino left behind no documented burial request, yet the way his friends and family handled his funeral and interment ensured that his myth would only grow larger after his death. Valentino was laid to rest at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but even his crypt carried an unusual story. It wasn't originally his. Instead, it was a borrowed space, generously provided by a friend. What was meant to be temporary has now endured nearly a century, with the crypt transforming into a shrine for generations of fans. Mourners lined the streets at his funeral, thousands gathering to say farewell to a man whose influence had transcended cinema. His resting place became a symbol not only of Hollywood's golden age, but also of the enduring power of stardom. Adding to the legend was the mysterious figure known as the Lady in Black. Beginning the year after Valentino's death, she appeared annually at his grave, leaving a single red rose as a token of mourning. For decades, her identity remained shrouded in secrecy, and even when others took up the tradition, the aura of mystery never faded. This ritual transformed Valentino's final resting place into more than a crypt. It became a living myth, a place where devotion and legend intertwined. Even in death, Valentino remained the ultimate romantic hero, forever adored, forever mourned. Greta Garbo. Alone in life, alone in death. Greta Garbo, the Swedish-born actress who reigned as one of Hollywood's most enigmatic stars, built her entire legacy around mystery. Famous for her haunting beauty and the simple but powerful line, "I want to be alone," Garbo withdrew from Hollywood at the height of her career, retreating into a life of privacy in New York City. Her final wishes carried that same desire for solitude, ensuring that even in death, she would remain apart from the frenzy of fame that had defined her early years. When she passed away in 1990, Garbo was cremated and laid to rest not in Hollywood but in her native Sweden, far from the bright lights of Los Angeles. Her ashes were interred at Skogskär Garden Cemetery in Stockholm, a UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its serene natural beauty. Remarkably, Garbo had purchased her burial plot decades earlier, in the 1950s, a decision that showed how carefully she had planned her departure from the spotlight. It was as though she wanted to ensure that, in the end, she could return to her roots, reconnecting with the homeland she had left behind. Her grave is marked only with a simple headstone bearing her name. No grand epitaph, no elaborate monument. For a woman who spent her life avoiding interviews, shunning publicity, and cultivating an aura of mystery, it was the perfect final statement. Fans who make the pilgrimage to her resting place find not the grandeur of a star's memorial, but the quiet presence of Garbo's enduring enigma. Even in death, she managed to preserve the solitude she had craved, leaving behind a legacy that is as elusive and fascinating as the woman herself. Mae West, a final performance. Mae West, the queen of wit and innuendo, was one of the most unapologetic stars Hollywood ever produced. Known for her razor-sharp one-liners, fearless sexuality, and refusal to conform to social expectations, she built a career on turning scandal into stardom. Even as she aged, West maintained her larger-than-life persona, dressing in dazzling gowns and delivering quips that reminded everyone she was still in control. So it came as no surprise that her burial reflected the same bold theatricality she brought to the stage and screen. When she passed away in 1980, West was buried in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, the city where her story had begun. Rather than choosing the glamour of Hollywood cemeteries, she returned to her roots, laid to rest in the West family mausoleum. But in true Mae West fashion, her final resting place carried a touch of drama. The inscription on her crypt reads, "Mae West, I'm no angel," a direct nod to one of her most famous films, and a fitting epitaph for a woman who defied the rules at every turn. Even in death, she ensured her voice and her wit would echo for generations. Adding to her flair for the dramatic, West had personally chosen the gown she wished to be buried in years before her passing. It was glamorous, extravagant, and unmistakably Mae. This final detail showed that to her, the afterlife was just another stage, another opportunity to make an entrance. Her burial wasn't simply a farewell, it was her last performance, a final bow that captured everything she stood for: confidence, defiance, and charm. For fans visiting her mausoleum, the message is clear. Mae West lived on her own terms, and she wasn't about to let death change that. W.C. Fields, the comedian who mocked California. W.C. Fields, one of Hollywood's most distinctive comedians, built his career on sarcasm, cynicism, and a disdain for authority that resonated with audiences. Known for his dry humor and love of alcohol, he carved out a persona that was equal parts brilliant and abrasive. It's no surprise then that even in contemplating his own death, Fields couldn't resist injecting humor into the plan. He often joked that his epitaph should read, "On the whole, I'd rather be in Philadelphia," a witty nod both to his hometown and to his lifelong disdain for California. When Fields died in 1946, his wishes weren't entirely fulfilled. Instead of being buried in Philadelphia, as he had long joked, his family interred him at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California. His grave, marked only by a simple plaque, lacked the humorous epitaph that had become so closely associated with his public persona. The decision disappointed some fans who had expected his trademark wit to live on in stone, but it also added an ironic twist. Fields, who had mocked California for much of his life, was destined to spend eternity there. This contrast between his wishes and reality only fueled speculation and curiosity around his final resting place. Some viewed it as a betrayal of his humor, while others saw it as the ultimate punchline. Fields had once again made people laugh, even if unintentionally. His understated burial stood in stark opposition to the loud, comedic legacy he left behind. For those who visit his grave, it serves as both a reminder of his wit and a symbol of the contradictions that defined him. A man who mocked convention but couldn't entirely escape it, even in death. Theda Bara. Ashes in the Pacific. Theda Bara, known as the original vamp of Hollywood, was one of the silent era's most enigmatic stars. With her dark costumes, heavy makeup, and sultry presence, she embodied mystery and danger on screen. Studios carefully crafted her image as a femme fatale, and audiences were captivated by her aura of exotic allure. But behind the carefully constructed persona was a woman whose final wishes revealed something very different, a longing to escape the artifice of Hollywood and return to something elemental. When she died in 1955, Bara requested to be cremated and for her ashes to be scattered into the Pacific Ocean. At the time, cremation was still relatively uncommon in the United States, especially among celebrities, making her choice both unusual and symbolic. It suggested a desire to break away from the heavy glamour that had defined her career, to dissolve quietly back into nature rather than lie beneath a marble monument. Yet even this final act of simplicity carried an air of mystery. For years, her ashes were not scattered immediately, but instead kept by her family, who struggled with the logistics and emotions of fulfilling her request. It wasn't until decades later that Bara's ashes were finally released into the ocean, honoring her wish at last. By then, most of her film legacy had already been lost. A 1937 Fox Studios fire destroyed the majority of her movies, leaving behind only fragments of her once thriving career. This tragic erasure only deepened the fascination with her as a figure of mystery. In many ways, her ashes scattering into the sea became a metaphor for her legacy itself. A star who once loomed large over Hollywood, now reduced to whispers of memory and myth, carried endlessly by the tides of time. From Elizabeth Taylor's Diamonds to Bela Lugosi's Dracula cape, and from Clark Gable's eternal devotion to Carole Lombard to Theda Bara's ashes scattered at sea. These Hollywood legends proved that even in death, they refused to be ordinary. Their final wishes were not just about burial, they were about identity, legacy, and control over how the world would remember them. In many ways, their funerals became their last performances, leaving behind stories as strange, dramatic, and unforgettable as the roles that made them stars.